How We Got Here, Episode 3 Paine, Spooner, and the Problem of Money. In the first episode, I walked through Madison's design and the way it has not held. In the second episode, I walked through the Anti-Federalists who predicted, in substantial measure, what would tend to happen under the document Madison was defending, and who closed by gesturing at the monetary dimension of the problem without developing the framework fully. This episode is about two thinkers who developed that framework. Thomas Paine wrote about money and government in 1786, the year before the Constitutional Convention. Lysander Spooner wrote about money, juries, vices, and constitutional legitimacy across 4 decades of the 19th century. Together, they produced a philosophical apparatus that the Anti-Federalists had begun to articulate. They worked through the principles that connect the constitutional questions to the monetary question. And in Spooner's case, he had something his predecessors did not have. He had the operation of the American system across most of its first century. He looked at that record and reached conclusions sharper than any his predecessors had reached. I want to take Paine first, then walk through the 4 threads of Spooner's thinking that together form the framework, and then close by connecting the framework to the analytical mechanism that ties the monetary critique to the broader pattern of wealth concentration and intergenerational injustice that the series has been describing. This is the longest episode in the series. The material is more demanding than what came before. I want to walk through it carefully because the framework matters for everything that follows. By the end of this episode, the analytical apparatus will be in place. Episode 4 then brings that apparatus to the present moment and addresses what it implies for where we now stand. Thomas Paine published dissertations on government, the affairs of the bank, and paper money in 1786. The pamphlet was written in response to debates in Pennsylvania over the Bank of North America and over the state's issuance of paper currency. Paine had been one of the most influential pamphleteers of the American Revolution. Common Sense had been published in 1776. The American Crisis had been published in installments through the war. By 1786, he was an established figure in American political writing, and his intervention in the monetary debates carried weight. The argument of the dissertations is more rigorous than most of what was being written on the subject. Paine started from a principle that the American founding generation broadly accepted. Voluntary exchange among individuals is the foundation of legitimate economic life. Government has limited authority to interfere with voluntary exchange, and the authority it does have must be exercised within constraints that protect the rights of the parties to the exchange. The implications for money is direct. Money is a contract between parties about the unit of exchange they will use in transactions. The value of money cannot be created by government decree. The value is established through voluntary acceptance by the parties using it. A note becomes money when the people receiving it are willing to accept it in exchange for goods and services. The state's role in declaring something to be legal tender is, on Paine's analysis, an attempt to use coercive authority to substitute for the voluntary acceptance that is the actual foundation of monetary value. Paine's specific target in 1786 was paper currency issued by government, unbacked by specie, and made legal tender by state authority. He argued that this kind of currency was, in operation, a form of fraud against the people who were compelled to accept it. The government issuing such currency was promising to pay value it did not have. The currency would, over time, lose value as the gap between the promise and the reality became visible. The losses would be borne by the people holding the currency, who had received it in exchange for real goods and services, and who would find that the currency they received purchased less than the goods they had given up for it. The transfer of value from holders of the currency to the government issuing it was, on Paine's analysis, a hidden tax that operated without the political accountability that visible taxation would require. The principle that Paine articulated has several components. The first is that gold and silver had emerged through centuries of voluntary acceptance across multiple societies as the forms of money that markets had selected. Their value was established through the process of voluntary acceptance. The selection was not arbitrary. Gold and silver had properties that made them suitable as money: durability, divisibility, portability, and scarcity. Markets had recognized these properties and had converged on these metals as the dominant forms of money over centuries. The convergence was a market outcome, not a state imposition. The second component is that paper currency, to be sound, had to be redeemable in specie. A paper note that promised a fixed quantity of gold or silver was, in Paine's analysis, a legitimate form of currency. The note was a contractual claim on a real asset. The issuer was obligated to honor the claim, and the market would evaluate whether the issuer was reliable. Notes from reliable issuers would circulate at face value. Notes from unreliable issuers would circulate at a discount or not at all. The market would discipline the issuance of paper currency through ordinary mechanisms of counterparty evaluation. The third component is that paper currency issued without backing in specie and made legal tender by state authority was a different thing entirely. It was not a contractual claim on a real asset. It was a declaration by the state that something was money because the state said so. The acceptance was compelled rather than voluntary. The value was supposed to be created by decree rather than established through market evaluation. Paine argued that this kind of currency could not retain its value over time. The gap between the state's declaration and the actual willingness of parties to accept the currency at face value would eventually force a depreciation. The depreciation would be borne by the people holding the currency, who had no recourse against the state that had issued it. The fourth component is the political implication. A state that could issue unbacked paper currency and compel its acceptance had a fiscal capacity that taxation alone would not have given it. The state could spend more than its tax revenue would support. The excess was financed by the depreciation of the currency, which operated as a hidden tax on the citizens holding the currency. The political process never had to confront in real time the question of whether the citizens were willing to pay for what the state was spending. The decision was made by the state and imposed on the citizens through the monetary mechanism. The political accountability that taxation would have produced was, in substantial measure, eliminated. This is the connection Paine drew between monetary authority and political authority. He did not develop it as fully as Spooner would 2 generations later, but he articulated the principle clearly enough that the rest of his analysis can be read as an extension of it. The legitimacy of money depends on voluntary acceptance. The legitimacy of government action funded by monetary manipulation is correspondingly compromised. A government that finances itself through unbacked paper money is, in important respects, taking value from citizens without their consent. The political legitimacy of such a government is, by the principles the American founding had articulated, substantially weakened. Paine's dissertation was not a famous document at the time. It had nothing like the influence of common sense or the rights of man. But its analytical structure is foundational for the tradition that Spooner would later develop. The principle that money is a contract between voluntary parties, and that the state authority over money is subject to the same constraints as state authority over any other voluntary contract, runs through American libertarian thought from Paine forward. It is the principle that connects the constitutional question to the monetary question, and it is the principle that the next 2 centuries of American monetary history would, in substantial part, fail to honor. Now to Spooner. Lysander Spooner was born in Massachusetts in 1808. He trained as a lawyer. He spent his career engaged in radical causes that have been, by the standards of any honest reader, vindicated by history. He was an abolitionist. He was an entrepreneur who challenged government monopoly. He was a defender of jury rights, an opponent of monopolies of all kinds, and an advocate for the dispersal of political and economic authority away from centralized institutions. I want to walk through 4 threads of Spooner's thinking, because the standard treatment of Spooner focuses on the most radical of his conclusions, while leaving aside the framework that produces them. The radical conclusion is the one about constitutional consent, which I will get to, but the conclusion follows from a developed philosophical framework that Spooner built across decades of writing. Without the framework, the conclusions appear as isolated extremism. With the framework, the conclusion is the application of a coherent set of principles to the most fundamental question. The 4 threads are the jury as a check on unjust law, the distinction between vices and crimes, the monetary framework, and the consent argument from no treason. I will take them in that order. The first thread is Spooner's work on the jury. The relevant texts are A Defense for Fugitive Slaves, published in 1850, and an essay on the trial by jury, published in 1852. The argument was developed in the context of the Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens and juries to participate in the return of escaped slaves to slavery. Spooner argued that no citizen and no jury was obligated to comply, regardless of what the law said, because the law itself was a violation of natural rights and therefore not actually law in any morally binding sense. The general principle that emerges from this work is that the legitimacy of any law depends upon its consistency with justice. A law that violates this standard is not actually a law in any morally binding sense. It is an act of force dressed up as a law. Citizens have no obligation to obey unjust laws. Juries have the right to refuse to convict under unjust laws, regardless of what judges tell them about the law's validity. The institution of the jury, properly understood, exists to provide a structured opportunity for ordinary citizens to refuse cooperation with injustice. The jury, on Spooner's view, was originally a check on government, not an instrument of government. Its proper role was to judge both the facts of a case and the justice of the law being applied. A jury that mechanically applies the law as instructed by the judge has, on this view, abandoned its constitutional function. A jury that judges the law and refuses to convict when the law is unjust is fulfilling the role the institution was designed to play. This argument is sometimes called jury nullification, and it has a longer history in Anglo-American law than is usually acknowledged. The famous cases of John Lilburn in the 17th century and William Penn in 1670 established the principle that juries had the right to refuse to convict against the evidence when conscience demanded it. The principle was carried into American law through the colonial trials of John Peter Zenger and others. By Spooner's time, the principle had been substantially eroded by judicial decisions that limited the jury's role to the determination of facts. Spooner argued that this erosion was an abandonment of the jury's proper function, and that restoring the jury's role as a check on unjust law was essential to the maintenance of liberty. The connection to the rest of his work is direct. If consent is the foundation of legitimate authority, and if no individual has actually consented to the government claiming authority over them, then the individual retains the right to refuse cooperation with that authority when conscience demands it. The jury system, properly understood, institutionalizes this right. It gives ordinary citizens a structured way to exercise their natural right of refusal when the state demands their cooperation with injustice. The second thread is vices are not crimes, a vindication of moral liberty, published in 1875. The argument is simple in its central claim and rigorous in its development. Vices, meaning behaviors that harm only the person engaged in them, are not properly subject to legal prohibition. Crimes, meaning behaviors that harm others without their consent, are. The distinction matters because the conflation of vices with crimes is, on Spooner's analysis, the foundation of much unjust legislation. A vice is something a person does that may harm themselves. A crime is something a person does that harms another. The two are categorically different because the second involves a violation of another's rights, while the first does not. The second is therefore properly within the scope of the law. The first is not. The standard objection to this distinction is that vices have social consequences that justify their prohibition. Drunkenness affects families, drug use affects communities, sexual behavior affects public morals. Spooner addressed these directly. He argued that the social consequences of vices are real, but that they are not the kind of harm that justifies the use of coercive law to prevent them. The same logic that would justify prohibiting drunkenness because it affects family would justify prohibiting almost any choice an individual makes, because almost every choice has some effect on someone else. The principle that distinguishes proper from improper subjects of law is whether the behavior involves a direct violation of another's rights, not whether it has indirect effects that someone considers undesirable. Spooner also made the practical argument. Laws prohibiting vices do not reduce the vices, at least not to anywhere near the extent their advocates claim. They drive the behaviors underground, create black markets, criminalize people who have harmed no one, and produce harms that have to be weighed against the harms the laws were intended to prevent. He was writing before Prohibition, before the modern drug war, before most of the 20th century's experiments in legislating morality. His analysis anticipated the structural problems with each of these projects. The empirical record of the last 150 years has, in substantial measure, confirmed his analysis. The deeper argument is the rights argument that runs through all his work. The right to govern one's own person, to make choices about one's own life, to engage in behaviors that affect only oneself, is, on Spooner's view, the most basic right an individual possesses. A government that violates this right has exceeded its proper authority, regardless of the popularity of the violation or the social goals it claims to serve. Spooner's individualism is most visible here. The individual is the locus of moral authority over their own life. The state has, on his view, no rightful jurisdiction over choices that do not involve the violation of others' rights. The connection to the rest of his work is again direct. If the state has limited authority over voluntary behavior between consenting parties, then state regulation of personal behavior beyond what protection of others' rights requires is an exercise of authority the state does not legitimately possess. This applies to the criminalization of vice. It also applies, as we will see, to state regulation of monetary contracts between voluntary parties. The third is Spooner's monetary writing. The most important pieces are constitutional law relative to credit, currency, and banking, published in 1843, and a new system of paper currency, published in 1861. The argument extends Paine's framework and develops it with greater precision. The starting point is the same principle that runs through all of Spooner's works. Individuals have the right to engage in voluntary contracts and exchanges, subject only to the requirement that they do not violate the rights of others. The implication for money and banking is direct. Individuals have the right to issue notes, extend credit, accept deposits, and engage in banking activities on whatever terms they and their counterparties voluntarily agree to. The state has, on this view, limited proper authority to prevent these activities, to regulate their terms, or to grant monopolies over them. Spooner's specific targets in the monetary writings are several. Usury laws, which limited the interest rate that could be charged on loans, were a violation of the right of individuals to contract on mutually acceptable terms. State granting banking monopolies, which prevented competing banks from issuing notes and accepting deposits, were a violation of the right of individuals to engage in legitimate commerce. Restrictions on the private issuance of paper currency were a violation of the same principle. The positive position is more radical than Paine's. Paine wanted government out of the money business and wanted currency restricted to specie or specie-backed paper. Spooner went further. He advocated competitive private issuance of currency on the basis of secure collateral, with the market determining which notes were trusted. Multiple banks should be free to issue notes. Multiple currencies should be free to circulate. The discipline of the market would produce a more stable and more honest monetary system than any state-controlled alternative, because banks issuing notes they could not redeem would lose customers, while banks issuing reliable notes would gain customers. The discipline operates through the ordinary mechanisms of counterparty evaluation that markets use in every other context. The deeper argument follows from Paine. Money is a contract between parties about the unit of exchange they will use in transactions. The state has, on this view, no more legitimate authority to dictate the terms of this contract than to dictate the terms of any other private contract. Currency is not a product of state authority. It is a product of voluntary acceptance by the parties using it. A note becomes money when the people receiving it are willing to accept it in exchange for goods and services. The state's role in declaring something to be legal tender is, on Spooner's analysis, a usurpation of authority that properly belongs to the parties to a transaction. The thread of Spooner's work has had a longer afterlife than is generally recognized. The arguments for free banking and against state monetary monopoly were taken up in the 20th century by Friedrich Hayek, particularly in Denationalization of Money, published in 1976. Lawrence White and other free banking theorists extended the tradition in the 1980s and 1990s. The intellectual lineage that runs from Paine through Spooner to Hayek and beyond is the lineage that, in episode 4, will connect to Satoshi and to the technical implementation of the philosophical position that the earlier thinkers could only articulate in principle. The fourth thread is the consent argument, which is the destination of Spooner's work and the most radical of his conclusions. The title, the relevant text, is No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, published in 1870. The title gives you the conclusion. The reasoning is what I want to spend time on. Spooner's argument begins with the premise that the American founding generation explicitly endorsed, that legitimate political authority depends upon the consent of the governed. This is not a premise Spooner invented. It is the premise of the Declaration of Independence. Quote, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Unquote. The American Revolution was justified in its own terms by the claim that the British government had violated this principle and that the American colonies were therefore entitled to withdraw from its authority. Spooner accepted this premise completely. He then asked a question that the founders had not asked with the same rigor. What does consent actually mean? And who has actually consented to the American government? His argument proceeds in steps that are individually simple and cumulatively challenging. First, he observed that the people who ratified the Constitution in 1787 and 1788 were a small subset of the population then living, and that those people were now dead. Whatever consent they gave to the Constitution belonged to them. It could not be transferred to their descendants. A contract entered into by one party cannot bind a party who did not exist at the time of contracting and who has not personally agreed to its terms. Second, he observed that the act of being born in a particular territory does not constitute consent to be governed by whatever political authority claims that territory. A child does not choose to be born, where to be born, A child is incapable of consent in any meaningful legal sense. Consent that is presumed from the mere fact of birth is not consent in any meaningful philosophical sense. If consent means anything, it must be the voluntary agreement of a competent adult to specific terms. The mere fact of geographical accidents does not produce it. Third, he addressed the standard response to these observations. One common response is that residence in a country constitutes consent, that by choosing to remain rather than emigrating, the resident has accepted the authority of the government. Spooner found this argument unpersuasive. He pointed out that emigration is costly, difficult, and often impossible for the poor, that the choice of consent or leave is not a free choice when the cost of leaving is the abandonment of family, community, livelihood, and property, and that the same logic applied to any other relationship would not be accepted. If a robber demanded your money and told you that by remaining on the road you had consented to be robbed, no one would accept that the consent was real. The choice, consent or face severe consequences, is not consent, it is duress. Another common response is that voting constitutes consent, that by participating in elections, citizens have endorsed a system in which the elections are held. Spooner addressed this directly. He pointed out that voting is, for many people, a defensive act rather than an act of endorsement. If a system of compulsory authority exists and one has no power to abolish it, voting in that system is an attempt to mitigate its worst effects rather than an endorsement of its existence. A person who votes to elect the less bad of two candidates has not consented to the underlying system. They have made a tactical choice within a system imposed on them. The conclusion he drew from this is the one that gives the pamphlet its title. The Constitution, he argued, has limited authority over anyone who has not personally and voluntarily consented to it. Since almost no one alive at his time had personally and voluntarily consented to it, the Constitution had, on his strict reading of the consent principle, limited authority over almost no one. The government claiming to act under its authority was, on his analysis, doing so on substantially fictional basis. The structure of obligation that the Constitution claimed to create was, in operative reality, the structure of coercion that any government creates, the imposition of the will of those who hold power on those who do not. The most quoted passage in the pamphlet, the one that summarizes the position, is this, quote, "But whether the Constitution really be one thing or another, this much is certain, that it has either authorized such a government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist," unquote. The Constitution either authorized what American government has become, in which case it endorses a system Spooner regards as deeply problematic, or it failed to prevent what American government has become, in which case its structural protections are substantially worthless. There is no third option in which the Constitution is both authoritative and limiting. The historical record of what has actually happened under it, on Spooner's analysis, forecloses the third option. I want to pause and address something directly, because the consent argument is challenging in ways that the previous threads of Spooner's thinking are not. The conclusion Spooner draws is uncomfortable for almost everyone. For people who venerate the founders and the Constitution, it is uncomfortable because it dismantles a piety that organizes much of American political identity. For people who believe in democratic government, it is uncomfortable because it challenges the legitimacy of the system through which they participate in political life. For people who hold any version of the consent of the governed principle, it is uncomfortable because it points out that no actual government has ever fully met the standard the principle requires. The natural impulse in countering an argument like this is to look for the flaw, to find the place where Spooner's reasoning breaks down, to identify the move that allows you to reject the conclusion while keeping the premises. People have been trying to find that flaw for 150 years. Some of the attempts are interesting. None of them, in my judgment, fully succeed in saving the premise of inherited consent. The most common move is to argue that consent in political philosophy means something different than consent in private contract law. Political consent, on this view, is collective rather than individual. It refers to the consent of the people as a whole, not to the consent of each individual. The American people collectively have consented to the Constitution through the act of operating under it and through the cumulative weight of 2.5 centuries of acceptance. The problem with this response is that it modifies the premise it claims to defend. The Declaration of Independence does not say that governments derive their just powers from the collective acceptance of the people over time. It says they derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. The Declaration was making an individual rights argument, not a collective acceptance argument. The shift from individual consent to collective acceptance argument, the shift from individual consent to collective acceptance is a substantive change in the underlying premise, not a clarification of it. And once that shift is made, the principle no longer rules anything out. Any government that exists has, by definition, achieved collective acceptance in the operative sense, because it exists. The principle becomes substantially circular. Whatever is consented to. There is no fully clean way to maintain both the consent principle and the unqualified legitimacy of any actual government. Spooner saw this. He followed the principle to its conclusion. The conclusion is uncomfortable, but the discomfort is intellectually honest discomfort. The discomfort is the absence of an easy answer to a hard question. Spooner pushes the consent principle to conclusions most political traditions ultimately retreat from. The serious responses to his arguments fall into several categories. Some thinkers hold the consent principle as a regulative ideal, a standard at which actual governments can be measured and criticized, even if no government will ever fully meet it. Some hold it as a basis for judging which government is better than another, with more consent-based legitimacy being better than less. Some hold it as a moral commitment that operates alongside other commitments, including the practical commitment to live within whatever political arrangement currently exists. Each of these positions takes Spooner's argument seriously without endorsing the most radical version of his conclusion. What is harder to hold, once Spooner's argument has been fully encountered or carefully encountered, is the comfortable middle position that treats the consent principle as a foundational value while simultaneously believing that any actual government fully meets the standard the principle requires. That position is, on careful examination, difficult to defend. Spooner did not invent the difficulty, he identified it. The four threads of Spooner's thinking, taken together, form a coherent framework. The jury writings address what individuals owe to unjust law. The Vice's writings addresses the proper scope of state authority over individual behavior. The monetary writings address the proper relationship between the state and the economic system, focusing on the medium of exchange. The constitutional writings address the legitimacy of the state itself. The framework is built from a small number of foundational principles. The individual is the locus of moral and political authority. Voluntary contracts and exchanges among individuals are the foundations of legitimate social order. The state has narrow and specific functions limited to the protection of individuals against the violation of their right by others. Beyond those functions, the state has, on this view, limited proper authority. This applies to law, to personal behavior, to the political order itself, and to the economic system. What is distinctive about Spooner is that he applied these principles consistently across the full range of questions political philosophy is supposed to address. He did not flinch from the conclusions the principles produced, even when the conclusions were unpopular. He pushed the principles further than the founders themselves had been willing to push them, because the principles, honestly applied, required the further pushing. The framework is powerful but bounded. It addresses voluntary contracts among competent adults, the proper response to unjust law, the scope of state authority over personal behavior, and the legitimacy of the political order. It does not, by itself, resolve every question political philosophy addresses. Children, incapacity, externalities that operate across many parties, public goods that no individual party can provide, common defense, environmental spillovers, and coordination problems on a scale that exceeds bilateral contracting all raise questions that the voluntary contract framework has to address through additional analytical work. Some of these questions can be handled within the framework, others require supplementary principles. The framework is not a complete political philosophy. It is a powerful set of analytical tools that apply to a substantial range of questions while having known limits at the edges. Episode 4 will return to these limits when the framework is brought to the present moment. I want to close this episode with the analytical mechanism that connects the framework to the broader pattern of wealth concentration and intergenerational injustice that the series has been describing. The mechanism is sometimes called the Cantillon effect, after Richard Cantillon, the earlier 18th century Irish-French economist who first described it. Cantillon observed that newly created money does not enter the economy uniformly. It enters at specific points, through specific channels, and the people closest to those entry points receive the new money first before prices have adjusted to reflect the increased money supply. They get to spend the new money at the old prices. The people farther from the entry points receive the new money later, after prices have already risen. They get to spend the new money at the new prices. The same nominal increase in money supply produces a substantially different real outcome depending on where in the chain a given recipient sits. The implication is significant. Monetary expansion is not a neutral phenomena that affects everyone equally. It is, in operation, a wealth transfer from the people who receive new money late to the people who receive it early. The people who receive it early benefit because they can buy assets at pre-inflation prices using the new money. The people who receive it late are correspondingly disadvantaged because by the time the new money reaches them, the prices of the things they want to buy have already adjusted upward. In the modern monetary system, the entry points for newly created money are well defined. New money enters through the banking system, primarily through commercial banks that receive reserves from the Federal Reserve and through the financial institutions that participate in open market operations. The first recipients of the new money tend to be large banks, primary dealers, and the financial institutions and corporations that have direct access to credit markets. The new money is used by these recipients to purchase financial assets, which is part of why asset prices rise during periods of monetary expansion. The new money then circulates outward through the economy, through wages, through prices, through the broader pattern of transactions. By the time it reaches ordinary workers, retirees, savers, and the poor, prices have already adjusted. The new dollars these later recipients receive purchase in substantial part less than the dollars the earlier recipients received. The wage increase that arrives after monetary expansion does not fully compensate the worker for the price increases that have occurred. The interest on a savings account often does not keep up with the inflation that the monetary expansion has produced. The fixed pension that supports a retiree purchases less than it did when the pension was negotiated. This is the Cantillon effect. It contributes to the wealth distribution patterns of the last several decades, alongside other factors that operate on the same patterns through different mechanisms. The wealthy have grown substantially wealthier in the period since the gold standard was abandoned, and the Federal Reserve was empowered to expand the monetary base with substantial discretion. Globalization, productivity growth, technological change, tax policy, and shifts in the labor market all contribute as well. The Cantillon effect is one mechanism among several. What distinguishes it analytically is that it operates through the monetary system itself, which means it is the mechanism most directly affected by changes to the monetary system. Other mechanisms operate through other channels and would not be addressed by monetary reform alone. I want to be careful here. The Cantillon argument is unfamiliar to most viewers, and it has to be developed carefully. The claim is not that monetary expansion is the sole cause of wealth concentration. The claim is that monetary expansion contributes to wealth concentration through a specific mechanism that operates regardless of the intentions of the people who run the system. The mechanism is structural. It would operate the same way under any monetary authority that expanded the money supply through the channels that exist. The connection to Paine and Spooner is direct. Both thinkers argued that unbacked paper, currency, and discretionary monetary expansion were forms of taking value from citizens without their consent. They did not have the modern theoretical apparatus to describe the Cantillon effect, but they were addressing the same underlying phenomena. The hidden tax of monetary depreciation is not just hidden in the sense of being unrecognized, it is also regressive in the sense of falling more heavily on the people farther from the entry points of new money. The injustice they identified has, in the modern monetary system, an analytical mechanism that operates as they predicted. The framework is now in place. Paine established that money is a contract between voluntary parties and that state authority over money is subject to the same constraints as state authority over any other voluntary contract. Spooner extended the framework into a complete philosophical position covering law, personal behavior, monetary contracts, and the legitimacy of the state itself. The four threads of his thinking form a coherent whole with the consent argument as the destination of a developed philosophical project rather than an isolated radical claim. The Cantillon effect provides the analytical mechanism that connects the framework to the observable pattern of wealth distribution in the modern economy. The injustice Paine and Spooner identified operates through a specific structural mechanism that contributes to the wealth concentration we observe. The framework taken together gives us the apparatus we need to understand the present moment. We have the diagnosis from Madison about what could go wrong with the constitutional structure. We have the predictions from the Anti-Federalists about what would tend to go wrong. We have the framework from Paine and Spooner about why the constitutional question and the monetary question are aspects of the same underlying problem. We have the Cantillon mechanism that explains how the monetary system contributes to the wealth concentration we observe. In the final episode, I want to bring this apparatus to the present moment. The argument is not that the diagnosis is sufficient. The argument is that the diagnosis is incomplete without recognition that the underlying problem has, for the first time in history, been demonstrated to have a technical solution in one domain. The solution is not the one Madison designed. It is not the one the Anti-Federalists proposed. It is not the one Paine and Spooner advocated. It is something none of them could have built because the technical apparatus did not exist. But it addresses the structural problem they were all describing. That is episode 4.